At my wedding reception, my sister announced we're moving into her house next week, while I was cutting the cake. But what happened next made everyone realize who the real family was. I'm Natasha, and I never imagined my perfect wedding day in the charming town of Willowbrook would turn into the moment that changed my entire relationship with my family forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. After 3 years of careful planning and saving every penny, my fiancé Derek and I had finally made it to our dream wedding day at the historic Rosewood Manor. The venue was everything we'd hoped for, a gorgeous Victorian estate with sprawling gardens, crystal chandeliers, and enough space for our 150 guests. We'd chosen October for the ceremony because the autumn leaves created the most breathtaking backdrop, and honestly, everything had been absolutely perfect up until that moment. Derek and I had been together for 6 years, and getting to this point hadn't been easy. We'd both worked multiple jobs to afford not just the wedding, but also the down payment on our first home, a beautiful 2-story colonial in the Maplewood district that we'd been renovating for months. It was our sanctuary, our fresh start, the place where we planned to build our life together. Every weekend, we'd been there painting walls, installing new fixtures, and carefully choosing furniture that reflected both our styles. The house represented everything we'd worked for, our independence, our future. My sister Cassandra had always been complicated. She's 28, 2 years younger than me, and has this way of making everything about her that I've never quite known how to handle. Growing up, our parents, Mom and Dad, who live in the neighboring town of Birchfield, always seemed to cater to her dramatic tendencies. When Cassandra wanted something, she usually found a way to get it, often at someone else's expense. But I'd learned to navigate around it, thinking that was just how families worked. Cassandra had been married to her husband Ryan for 4 years now, and they'd been living in a cramped apartment downtown in Willowbrook while supposedly saving for their own place. At least, that's what they always claimed whenever the topic of their living situation came up at family dinners. Ryan worked in construction, making decent money, and Cassandra had a job at the local bank, so it's not like they were struggling financially. But somehow, they never seemed to make progress toward homeownership, always finding reasons to spend their savings on vacations, new cars, or whatever caught their fancy. What made this particularly complicated was that 6 months ago, during one of our regular family Sunday dinners at Mom and Dad's house in Birchfield, Derek and I had made the mistake of mentioning that our new house had an extra bedroom and a finished basement. We'd been excited about the space, talking about how we might use it as a home office or maybe a guest room for when family visited. It was innocent conversation, just sharing our joy about this new chapter in our lives. That's when Cassandra had first mentioned, seemingly casually, how nice it would be to have more space. She'd made some comment about how their current apartment was feeling cramped, especially with Ryan's tools and equipment taking up so much room. At the time, Derek and I had nodded politely and changed the subject, not thinking much of it. But over the following months, these comments became more frequent and more pointed. During our engagement party in July, Cassandra had cornered me near the dessert table and said something that should have been a red flag. "You know, Tasha, it's going to be so great having all that extra space in your new house. Family should help family, right?" When I'd asked her what she meant, she just smiled and said we'd figure it out eventually. I'd brushed it off as her usual dramatic way of speaking, but now I realized she'd already been planning something. The wedding ceremony itself had been absolutely magical. Derek looked incredible in his navy blue suit, standing at the altar of St. Augustine's Church with tears in his eyes as I walked down the aisle in my grandmother's vintage lace dress, which I'd had perfectly altered. Our vows were personal and heartfelt, and when Father Mitchell pronounced us husband and wife, I genuinely felt like the luckiest woman in the world. All our friends and family were there, Derek's parents who'd driven up from Seaside Heights, my college roommates, our work colleagues, everyone who mattered to us. The reception at Rosewood Manor had been everything we dreamed of. The cocktail hour on the garden terrace was perfect, with guests mingling among the rose bushes and string lights as the sun set behind the oak trees. Dinner was flawless. We'd chosen the herb-crusted salmon and beef tenderloin, and our wedding cake was a 3-tier masterpiece with buttercream roses that matched my bouquet exactly. Derek and I had just finished our first dance to At Last, by Etta James, and the evening was flowing beautifully. His best man, his brother Jake, had given a hilarious speech about Derek's terrible cooking skills and how lucky he was to find someone who actually knew how to use a kitchen. My maid of honor, my best friend from college, Amber, had shared sweet stories about our friendship and how she'd watched Derek and me fall in love. The moment had finally come for the cake cutting, something I'd been looking forward to all night. Derek and I stood behind our beautiful wedding cake, with all our guests gathered around us, cameras flashing, everyone smiling and cheering. It was supposed to be one of those perfect, timeless wedding moments that you remember forever. Derek had his hand over mine on the cake knife, and we were both laughing about something he'd whispered in my ear. That's when Cassandra stepped forward from the crowd, wine glass in hand, and announced in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "Since we're all here celebrating new beginnings, Ryan and I have some news too. We're moving into Tasha and Derek's house next week." That's when Cassandra stepped forward from the crowd, wine glass in hand, and announced in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "Since we're all here celebrating new beginnings, Ryan and I have some news too. We're moving into Tasha and Derek's house next week." The entire reception fell silent, and that's when everything I thought I knew about my family began to unravel. Looking back now, I realize how naive I was to think this wedding would be the peaceful, drama-free celebration Derek and I had meticulously planned. We'd spent countless evenings at our kitchen table in our new Maplewood home, going through every detail with our wedding planner, Jennifer, making sure everything would be absolutely perfect. This wasn't just supposed to be a party, it was meant to be the official beginning of our independent life together, surrounded by the people who truly supported us. Derek and I had envisioned this day so many times during our engagement. We'd talked about how magical it would feel to finally be married, to stand up in front of everyone we loved and make those promises to each other. We'd imagined dancing the night away, seeing our grandparents sharing stories with our friends, watching our college buddies embarrass us with old photos during the speeches. It was supposed to be joyful, stress-free, and entirely focused on celebrating our love and commitment. The financial aspect alone represented 2 years of careful sacrifice and planning. We'd skipped vacations, eaten countless homemade dinners instead of going out, and Derek had even taken on extra weekend construction projects to boost our wedding budget. Every detail of this reception had been thoughtfully chosen and paid for with money we'd earned through genuine hard work and discipline. The venue deposit, the catering, the flowers, the photographer, everything represented a piece of our shared dream coming to life. Our new house had been another massive undertaking that we'd approached with the same level of dedication and planning. We'd spent months house hunting throughout Willowbrook and the surrounding areas, finally falling in love with this particular colonial because it felt like home the moment we walked through the front door. The mortgage application process had been rigorous. We'd provided every bank statement, pay stub, and financial document imaginable to prove we were ready for homeownership. Derek had been so proud when we got the keys 3 months ago. I'll never forget the look on his face as he carried me over the threshold, both of us laughing and crying at the same time. We'd spent every free weekend since then making it truly ours, painting the master bedroom a soft sage green, installing new light fixtures in the dining room, and carefully arranging the furniture we'd been collecting piece by piece. The guest room upstairs had become Derek's temporary office while he worked on getting his contractor's license, and the basement was slowly being converted into a cozy family room where we could watch movies and host game nights. What made this house so special wasn't just the physical space, but what it represented for our relationship. For the first time, we had a place that was completely ours, where we could establish our own traditions and routines without anyone else's input or interference. Derek could leave his tools spread out on the basement workbench without anyone complaining. I could rearrange the living room furniture whenever I felt like it, or spend Sunday mornings reading in the sunny breakfast nook with my coffee and crossword puzzles. We'd been so excited about hosting our first Thanksgiving there in just a few weeks, with Derek's parents coming up from Seaside Heights and my parents driving over from Birchfield. I'd already bought new linens for the guest room and had been planning the menu for months. It was going to be our debut as the hosts, the established couple with their own home, finally able to give back to the families who had supported us throughout our relationship. The independence we'd gained from homeownership had changed our dynamic with both our families in such positive ways. Instead of always being the young couple who needed help or advice, we were becoming the ones who could offer to help others. Derek had already assisted his younger cousin with some electrical work, and I'd been planning to host my mom's book club at our house next month. We were stepping into this new role as contributing adults, and it felt incredible. Our wedding planning had been deliberately inclusive but boundaried. We'd made sure both families felt involved in the important decisions while maintaining control over the overall vision. Derek's mom had helped choose the flowers, and my dad had walked me down the aisle wearing the cufflinks that belonged to Derek's grandfather. Cassandra had been included as one of my bridesmaids, and she'd seemed genuinely happy during the dress fittings and bridal shower planning. There had been no indication that she was harboring any resentment or planning any kind of disruption. The morning of the wedding, I'd woken up in the bridal suite at Rosewood Manor feeling nothing but pure excitement and gratitude. Amber had surprised me with breakfast from my favorite bakery in town, and we'd spent the morning listening to our favorite playlist while the hair and makeup team worked their magic. My mom had cried happy tears when she saw me in my dress, and even Cassandra had seemed emotional and supportive during the getting ready photos. During the ceremony, I'd caught Derek's eye several times, and we'd shared these secret smiles that felt like promises of all the adventures waiting for us. When Father Mitchell talked about marriage being a partnership built on mutual respect and shared dreams, I'd felt so confident that Derek and I had exactly that foundation. We'd already proven we could work together through challenges, the stress of house hunting, the complexity of wedding planning, the normal ups and downs of any long-term relationship. The cocktail hour had exceeded every expectation. Our photographer, Rebecca, had captured beautiful shots of us with various family members and friend groups against the backdrop of Rosewood Manor's gorgeous autumn gardens. Derek's construction crew buddies had mingled easily with my co-workers from the marketing firm, and I'd watched my college friends swap stories with Derek's high school friends like they'd known each other for years. Even dinner had gone perfectly according to plan. Our caterer had executed everything flawlessly, from the appetizer service to the seamless transition between courses. The speeches during dinner had been heartfelt and appropriate. Derek's dad had welcomed me to their family with such warmth, and my maid of honor had perfectly captured the essence of our relationship without embarrassing anyone or going on too long. As we'd approached the cake cutting, I'd felt this overwhelming sense of completion and joy. Here we were, officially married, surrounded by everyone we loved, in this beautiful setting we'd worked so hard to afford. The cake itself was a work of art, 3 tiers decorated with sugar flowers that matched my bouquet exactly, created by the same baker who'd made my parents' wedding cake 32 years ago. This was supposed to be the moment captured in photos that would sit on our mantle for the next 50 years. Derek and I, young and happy and hopeful, taking this sweet, traditional step together while our loved ones cheered us on. It was meant to symbolize the sweetness we'd share in our marriage, the way we'd support each other through life's big and small moments. Instead, it became the moment everything changed forever. The relationship between Cassandra and me had always been complicated, but I'd never fully understood just how deeply rooted the issues were until I started really thinking about our childhood patterns after Derek and I got engaged. Growing up in our family home on Elmwood Street in Birchfield, there was this unspoken dynamic that I'd accepted as normal sibling rivalry, but looking back now, I can see it was something much more calculated and concerning. Our parents, Robert and Linda, had always treated us fairly in terms of material things. We got equal allowances, similar birthday parties, the same opportunities for extracurricular activities. But when it came to attention and emotional energy, somehow Cassandra always seemed to require more, and our parents had developed this habit of accommodating her needs while expecting me to be understanding and flexible. I was the easy child, the one who didn't make waves, so naturally I became the one who was expected to compromise when conflicts arose. The pattern started early. When I was 8 and Cassandra was 6, I'd saved my allowance for 3 months to buy this beautiful dollhouse I'd seen at Morrison's toy store downtown. The day before my birthday, when I was supposed to get it, Cassandra had a complete meltdown because she wanted the same dollhouse. Instead of using it as a teaching moment about patience and saving money, my parents suggested we share the dollhouse and split the cost. Suddenly, my 3 months of careful saving became a joint gift, and Cassandra got equal ownership of something she hadn't worked for at all. In middle school, I'd been selected for the advanced math program at Birchfield Academy, something I'd worked really hard to qualify for. I was so proud and excited to tell my parents about this achievement. But that same week, Cassandra had auditioned for the school play and hadn't gotten the lead role she wanted. She was devastated, crying every night and refusing to participate in the production at all. My parents spent so much time and energy consoling her and trying to convince the drama teacher to reconsider that my math program acceptance barely got acknowledged. We never even celebrated it properly. The pattern continued through high school. When I was accepted to Riverside University with a partial academic scholarship, something I'd worked toward for 4 years with excellent grades and community service, Cassandra announced that she decided she didn't want to go to college right away. She wanted to take a gap year to find herself and travel around Europe. Somehow, the money my parents had been saving for her education got redirected to fund this European adventure, while I took out student loans to cover what my scholarship didn't pay for. During my college years, every time I came home with good news, making Dean's List, getting an internship, landing my first job after graduation, Cassandra would have some crisis that needed immediate family attention. When I graduated summa cum laude, Cassandra had just broken up with her boyfriend of 2 years and needed to move back home. When I got promoted to senior marketing coordinator at Henderson & Associates, Cassandra had decided to quit her job at the insurance company because her boss was impossible to work with. What I didn't realize until much later was how these incidents affected my ability to advocate for myself or recognize when boundaries were being crossed. I'd learned to expect that my achievements would be overshadowed, that my needs would come second, that being that I'm mature, one meant constantly stepping aside to accommodate Cassandra's drama. It became so automatic that I stopped even feeling disappointed when it happened. Derek was the first person to really point out these patterns to me. About 6 months into our relationship, we'd gone to my parents' house for Sunday dinner, and Cassandra had spent the entire meal complaining about her apartment complex's new noise policy. She'd received a warning about her music being too loud, and she was convinced it was personal discrimination because she was young. She went on and on about how unfair it was, how she was being targeted, how she might need to break her lease and move somewhere else. I'd automatically shifted into supportive sister mode, asking questions and offering suggestions for how she could resolve the situation. But Derek noticed something I hadn't. Every time I tried to change the subject or mention something about our own lives, Cassandra would escalate her story to pull the attention back to her problems. When I mentioned that we were thinking about taking a weekend trip to the mountains, she suddenly remembered additional details about her neighbor conflicts that required immediate discussion. On the drive home, Derek gently asked me if I'd noticed how the entire dinner conversation had been about Cassandra's apartment situation. When I really thought about it, I realized that she'd managed to dominate 3 hours of family time with a problem that could have been resolved with a simple conversation with her property manager. But more importantly, Derek helped me see that this wasn't unusual, it was the standard dynamic for our family gatherings. The housing situation had been building for months in ways I hadn't fully recognized at the time. It started about a year ago when Cassandra and Ryan began making comments about how expensive rent was getting in Willowbrook. They'd signed a 2-year lease on their current apartment, but they were constantly complaining about the cost and talking about how much money they were throwing away on rent instead of building equity through homeownership. At first, these seemed like normal young adult concerns. Derek and I certainly understood the frustration of paying rent while trying to save for a house down payment. We'd been in the same situation ourselves just a few years earlier, living in a tiny 1-bedroom apartment above the bakery on Main Street while every spare dollar went into our house fund. But Cassandra and Ryan's complaints had a different quality to them. Instead of talking about their savings plan or looking at houses in their price range, they seemed to focus on how unfair it was that other people their age already owned homes. There was this underlying resentment in their conversations, as if homeownership was something that should be handed to them rather than something they needed to work toward. When Derek and I announced that we'd been approved for our mortgage, Cassandra's initial reaction had been congratulations, but there was something off about her enthusiasm. She asked a lot of detailed questions about our down payment, our monthly payments, and especially about the extra space we'd have. She wanted to know exactly how many bedrooms, whether the basement was finished, if there was space for guests. At our housewarming party 2 months ago, Cassandra and Ryan had toured every room multiple times. They'd spent an unusually long time in the guest bedroom, commenting on how nice it was, how much storage space there was, how it even had its own bathroom. Ryan had been particularly interested in the basement, asking about the electrical setup and whether it would be suitable for his woodworking hobby. What should have been red flags were these casual comments they'd made throughout the summer about how lucky Derek and I were to have so much space, and how nice it would be if family members could help each other out with housing costs. Cassandra had mentioned several times how expensive their rent was, always followed by pointed looks around our house and comments about how we rattled around in all that space. The most concerning incident had happened just 3 weeks before the wedding. Cassandra had called me crying, saying that their landlord was raising their rent by $200 a month when their lease renewed in January. She'd gone on about how impossible it would be to afford, how they might have to move to a different town, how stressful it was to deal with housing uncertainty right before my wedding. I'd offered to help them look at other rental options or review their budget to see where they might cut expenses. But instead of taking me up on those offers, Cassandra had said something that should have been a massive warning sign. Well, I guess we'll figure something out. Family always finds a way to help family, right? Now, standing at my wedding reception with cake knife in hand, I finally understood what she'd been planning all along. The reception had been flowing like a perfectly choreographed dance up until that moment. Derek and I had been floating on cloud 9, moving from table to table during dinner, sharing hugs and catching up with relatives we hadn't seen in months. The atmosphere at Rosewood Manor was everything we dreamed it would be, warm, elegant, and filled with genuine joy from everyone who mattered to us. Our DJ, Marcus Thompson from Harmony Entertainment, had been reading the room perfectly all evening. During cocktail hour, he'd played the sophisticated jazz playlist we'd carefully curated, creating the perfect backdrop for conversation without overwhelming anyone's ability to mingle. Throughout dinner, he'd kept the music at just the right volume, transitioning seamlessly between our favorite romantic songs and more upbeat tracks that kept the energy positive without being distracting. The toasts during dinner had exceeded all our expectations. Derek's father, William, had stood up first with a glass of champagne, his voice slightly shaky with emotion as he welcomed me officially into their family. He'd shared the story of how Derek had called him after our third date, saying he'd met the woman he was going to marry, and how right Derek had been. The whole room had gotten teary-eyed when William talked about watching his son become the best version of himself in our relationship. My father had followed with his own toast, and I'd been amazed by how eloquently he'd spoken about watching Derek and me build our partnership over the years. Dad had always been a man of few words, but that night he'd talked about the importance of finding someone who makes you want to be better, and how he'd seen that quality in our relationship from the very beginning. He'd ended by saying that he'd gained not just a son-in-law, but a true friend in Derek, which had made Derek tear up completely. Jake, Derek's brother and best man, had delivered the perfect combination of humor and heart in his speech. He'd told embarrassing stories about Derek's failed attempts at cooking during their bachelor days, complete with dramatic reenactments that had everyone in stitches. But then he'd shifted to talking about how Derek had changed since meeting me, becoming more confident, more focused, more genuinely happy than Jake had ever seen him. The way Jake had looked at both of us while talking about the strength of our partnership had felt like a blessing from Derek's family. Amber, my maid of honor, had been the final speaker, and she'd absolutely nailed it. She'd known me since our freshman year at Riverside University, so she had plenty of stories to choose from, but she'd selected ones that perfectly captured our friendship and my relationship with Derek. She'd talked about the night I'd called her after my second date with Derek, unable to stop talking about this amazing man I'd met. She'd reminded everyone about how Derek had driven 4 hours to bring me soup when I had the flu during our senior year, and how that's when she'd known he was the one. The dinner itself had been executed flawlessly by the catering team from Savory Seasons. We'd chosen the herb-crusted Atlantic salmon and the rosemary beef tenderloin, both of which had been cooked to absolute perfection. The seasonal vegetable medley featured local produce from Hartwell Farms, and even our vegetarian guests had raved about the butternut squash risotto option. The wine pairings our coordinator had suggested complemented each course beautifully, and the service had been so smooth that guests barely noticed the staff moving between tables. Between courses, Derek and I had managed to visit every table, sharing personal moments with each group of guests. At the table with my college friends, we'd laughed about old memories from our dorm days and caught up on everyone's career updates and relationships. Derek's construction crew had regaled us with stories from recent job sites, and they'd presented us with a beautiful handmade wooden cutting board that one of his co-workers had crafted in his home workshop. Our grandparents' table had been particularly special. Derek's grandmother, Eleanor, had been telling stories about her own wedding day 73 years ago, drawing parallels to our celebration that had made everyone at the table feel connected across generations. My grandfather had been in his element, entertaining Derek's grandparents with his collection of terrible dad jokes, while my grandmother had been showing off photos of the quilt she'd been making for our new home. The first dance had been magical beyond anything we'd practiced. We'd taken lessons at Arthur Murray Dance Studio for 3 months leading up to the wedding, learning a simple but elegant routine to "The Way You Look Tonight" by Frank Sinatra. But when the moment actually arrived, with all our loved ones gathered around the dance floor and the soft lighting creating this romantic atmosphere, it felt like we were the only two people in the world. Derek had whispered sweet things in my ear throughout the song, making me laugh and cry happy tears at the same time. Following our first dance, Derek's parents had joined us for the traditional parent dances. I danced with William to "Butterfly Kisses," a song that had always made me emotional but took on even deeper meaning as I officially became his daughter-in-law. Derek had danced with my mother to "A Mother Like You," and watching them together had filled my heart with such gratitude for how seamlessly our families had blended throughout our relationship. The party had really gotten started when the DJ opened up the dance floor to everyone else. Our carefully crafted playlist spanned decades and genres, ensuring there was something for every generation represented at our wedding. The older guests had gravitated toward the classic Motown hits, while our friends had enthusiastically embraced the more contemporary songs we'd included. Even some of the most reserved family members had eventually made their way onto the dance floor, caught up in the infectious energy of the celebration. Derek and I had been amazed by how naturally everyone seemed to be enjoying themselves. There had been no awkward moments or family drama, no complaints about the food or music, no logistical issues with the venue or vendors. Everything we'd worried about during the planning process had worked out perfectly, and we'd been able to truly relax and enjoy our own party in a way that many couples never get to experience. The photography throughout the evening had been capturing all these perfect moments. Rebecca and her assistant had been moving seamlessly through the crowd, documenting candid interactions and formal groupings with equal skill. During dinner, they'd gotten beautiful shots of the toasts, and during dancing, they'd captured the pure joy on everyone's faces. We'd already seen some of the preview images on the back of Rebecca's camera, and they were exactly the kind of timeless, emotional photos we'd hoped for. As the evening progressed toward the cake cutting, Derek and I had been commenting to each other about how perfectly everything had gone. We'd worried unnecessarily about so many details during the planning process, but every vendor had exceeded our expectations, every family member had been on their best behavior, and every element had come together to create exactly the wedding we'd envisioned. The cake itself was positioned perfectly on its own table near the dance floor, surrounded by flickering votive candles and small arrangements of white roses and baby's breath. Our baker, Helen from Sweet Celebrations, had outdone herself with the 3-tier masterpiece. The bottom layer was vanilla bean cake with raspberry filling, the middle layer was chocolate with salted caramel, and the top layer was lemon with cream cheese frosting, representing all our favorite flavors combined into one stunning dessert. Derek and I approached the cake table with huge smiles, feeling like we were floating on air from all the love and celebration surrounding us. Our guests had naturally gathered around, phones and cameras ready to capture this traditional wedding moment. The lighting was perfect, the atmosphere was magical, and we were both thinking about how this would be one of those photos we'd look back on for the rest of our lives. Derek had his hand placed gently over mine on the ornate silver cake server we'd borrowed from his grandmother. We were both laughing about something he'd just whispered about saving the top tier for our first anniversary, a tradition his parents had started and that we planned to continue. The moment felt suspended in time, pure and perfect and exactly what we dreamed our wedding would be. That's when Cassandra stepped forward from the crowd, and everything changed. The words hit the room like a physical blow. "Since we're all here celebrating new beginnings, Ryan and I have some news too. We're moving into Tasha and Derek's house next week." Cassandra's voice rang out with this strange mixture of excitement and defiance, as if she was announcing something wonderful that everyone should be thrilled about. For a moment, I genuinely thought I had misheard her. The acoustics in Rosewood Manor's main hall could be tricky sometimes, and with all the ambient noise from the reception, surely she hadn't just said what I thought she'd said. I looked at Derek, still holding the cake knife together, and saw my own confusion reflected in his eyes. His mouth had fallen slightly open, and he was staring at Cassandra with the same bewildered expression I could feel on my own face. But then Cassandra continued, and there was no mistaking her words or her intentions. "We've been planning this for weeks. Ryan and I figured out that it makes so much more financial sense for all of us if we share the mortgage and utilities. Tasha and Derek have all that extra space just sitting empty, and we're throwing money away on rent every month. It's really the perfect solution for everyone. She was gesturing enthusiastically with her wine glass, and I noticed she'd clearly had quite a bit to drink throughout the evening. Her cheeks were flushed, and there was this manic energy in her movements that I recognized from childhood. It was the same way she'd acted when she was about to get in trouble but was trying to convince everyone that her questionable decision was actually brilliant. Ryan was standing slightly behind her, and the look on his face told me everything I needed to know about his level of involvement in this plan. His eyes were wide with what appeared to be genuine shock, and he kept glancing between Cassandra and me like he was watching a tennis match. His mouth opened and closed a few times as if he wanted to say something, but no words came out. It was becoming clear that this announcement was as much of a surprise to him as it was to everyone else. The crowd around the cake table had gone completely silent. Our guests were looking back and forth between Cassandra and me, trying to process what they'd just heard and figure out how they were supposed to react. Some people were still holding up their phones to record what they'd thought was going to be a sweet cake-cutting moment, but now their cameras were capturing something entirely different. I could see my parents near the front of the crowd, and my mother's face had gone completely pale. She was gripping my father's arm with both hands, and I could practically see her brain working overtime to figure out how to manage this situation. My father looked like he was having trouble breathing, his face cycling through confusion, embarrassment, and what appeared to be dawning anger as he began to understand what was happening. Derek's parents were standing to our left, and the expressions on their faces were transitioning from polite confusion to clear disapproval. William's jaw was set in a way I'd rarely seen, and Derek's mother had her hand pressed to her chest like she was having heart palpitations. They'd welcomed me into their family with such warmth and acceptance, and now they were watching my sister create chaos at what should have been a perfect family celebration. Amber was positioned near the dance floor, and I caught her eye for just a moment. She was shaking her head slightly, and I could see her lips form the word, no, as if she could somehow prevent this from happening through sheer force of will. Jake was standing next to her, and his expression had shifted from confusion to protective anger as he began to understand that his new sister-in-law was being blindsided at her own wedding. But it was our other guests' faces that really drove home how inappropriate this moment was. Derek's co-workers from the construction company looked uncomfortable and confused, clearly sensing drama but not understanding the family dynamics at play. My colleagues from Henderson and Associates were exchanging concerned glances, and I could practically see them mentally taking notes for the office gossip that would inevitably follow. Our college friends were the most expressive in their reactions. These were people who knew me well, who understood my personality and my relationship patterns. They could see the shock and hurt on my face, and several of them were shaking their heads or making disgusted faces at Cassandra's timing and approach. Rachel, my sorority sister who'd flown in from Seattle for the wedding, looked like she wanted to physically intervene. The elderly relatives were perhaps the most disturbed by what was happening. Derek's grandparents and my own grandparents had grown up in an era where certain social boundaries were absolutely sacred, and announcing major life decisions at someone else's wedding was unthinkable. I could see my grandmother's face had gone rigid with disapproval, and Derek's grandfather was whispering something urgent to his wife. Meanwhile, Cassandra seemed oblivious to the mounting tension in the room. She was still talking, elaborating on her plan, as if she was presenting a reasonable business proposal instead of dropping a bomb at my wedding reception. We've already started packing some of our things. We figured we could move Ryan's workshop equipment into the basement, and I can set up my home office in that extra bedroom upstairs. It'll be like having our own little apartment, but with shared common spaces. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The cake knife was still in my hand, Derek's hand still covering mine, but neither of us was moving. I felt completely frozen, like my brain couldn't process what was happening quickly enough to formulate any kind of response. This was supposed to be the moment when Derek and I cut our wedding cake together, feeding each other small bites while our loved ones cheered and took pictures. Instead, I was standing there trying to understand how my sister had convinced herself that announcing her intention to move into our house, without asking, was appropriate wedding reception entertainment. Ryan finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than actual speech. "Cassie, what are you doing?" he managed to say, reaching for her arm. "We never talked about announcing this tonight. We never even talked about doing this at all." But Cassandra brushed him off with a dismissive wave. "Oh, come on, Ryan, don't be shy. Everyone here loves us, and they want what's best for our family. Tasha and Derek are always saying how much they want to help people, and this is the perfect opportunity." That's when I finally found my voice, though it sounded strange and distant to my own ears. "Cassandra, what are you talking about? We never agreed to this. We never even discussed this." She looked at me with this expression of exaggerated surprise, as if I was being unreasonable for questioning her announcement. "Well, of course we're going to discuss the details. But I figured since everyone's here, we might as well let them know about our new living arrangement. They're going to find out eventually anyway." The presumption in her words, the complete lack of consideration for my feelings or Derek's, the utter disregard for the sanctity of our wedding day, it all hit me at once like a physical blow. She hadn't just made an inappropriate announcement, she'd attempted to hijack our wedding to manipulate us into agreeing to something we'd never consented to, using the public setting and the presence of our families as leverage. And then I realized that every single person at our wedding reception was watching to see how Derek and I would respond to this unprecedented breach of boundaries, and the cake knife in my hand had begun to tremble. The silence that followed my question stretched on for what felt like an eternity, though it probably lasted only seconds. I could feel my heart pounding so hard that I was sure everyone around us could hear it. The beautiful reception hall, which moments before had been filled with joy and celebration, now felt suffocating and tense. Every single person in that room was staring at us, waiting to see how this impossible situation would unfold. My hands had started shaking so badly that I had to grip the cake knife tighter to keep from dropping it entirely. Derek's hand, still covering mine, had gone rigid, and I could feel the tension radiating through his entire body. We were supposed to be cutting our wedding cake, smiling for photos that would sit on our mantle for decades to come, but instead we were frozen in this surreal moment that felt more like a nightmare than reality. Cassandra seemed genuinely confused by my response, as if she couldn't understand why I wasn't immediately embracing her wonderful plan. She tilted her head slightly and gave me this patronizing smile that I remembered from childhood, the same expression she'd worn when she was trying to convince our parents that breaking my toys had been an accident, or that eating my Halloween candy had been a favor to help me avoid cavities. "Tasha, don't be dramatic," she said with a little laugh that sounded forced and unnatural in the dead silence of the room. "We're family. This is what families do, they help each other out. You and Derek have this huge house with all that empty space, and Ryan and I are struggling with our rent situation. It's really a win-win for everyone involved." I felt like I was watching this scene unfold from outside my own body. The rational part of my brain was trying to process what was happening and formulate some kind of appropriate response, but the emotional part of me was completely overwhelmed by shock, hurt, and a growing sense of anger that I'd never experienced before in my life. This was my wedding day, the day Derek and I had planned and saved for and dreamed about, and my sister was treating it like a casual family dinner where she could make major announcements and assumptions about our lives. Ryan looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. His face had gone from confused to mortified as he began to understand the full scope of what Cassandra had just done. He was shaking his head slightly and mouthing, "I'm sorry," in my direction, clearly trying to distance himself from this disaster. The poor man looked like he'd been ambushed just as much as Derek and I had been. I could see our wedding photographer, Rebecca, still positioned nearby with her camera, but she'd lowered it and was looking around uncertainly, clearly unsure whether she should be documenting this moment or pretending it wasn't happening. The DJ had stopped the background music entirely, apparently sensing that something significant was occurring, which only made the silence more deafening and uncomfortable. My mother had moved closer to the front of the crowd, and I could see her wrestling with her natural instinct to smooth over family conflicts and her growing understanding that this situation was far beyond normal sibling drama. Her face was cycling through emotions, embarrassment, concern, disappointment, and what looked like genuine anger. My father was right behind her, and his jaw was set in a way that meant he was fighting to control his temper. Derek's family was having their own silent reaction to the unfolding drama. His parents had always been incredibly welcoming and inclusive toward my family, but I could see them exchanging meaningful glances as they witnessed this behavior for the first time. William looked like he was struggling between his natural politeness and his protective instincts toward his son, while Derek's mother appeared to be going through the same emotional process my own mother was experiencing. The guests from Derek's construction crew were particularly uncomfortable, shifting their weight and looking around as if hoping someone would provide guidance on how to handle this unprecedented breach of social etiquette. These were straightforward, hard-working men who valued honesty and respect, and they were clearly disturbed by what they were witnessing. Several of them were whispering to each other, probably trying to figure out if this was some kind of strange family tradition they didn't understand. My college friends were more openly expressing their shock and disapproval. These were people who knew me well, who understood my relationship with Cassandra and had witnessed her attention-seeking behavior during our college years. I could see Amber making subtle hand gestures like she wanted to intervene but wasn't sure how to do it appropriately. Rachel looked like she was physically restraining herself from saying something, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Meanwhile, Cassandra continued talking, apparently interpreting the stunned silence as an opportunity to elaborate on her plan rather than a sign that she'd massively overstepped. "We've already looked into the logistics," she said, her voice taking on this businesslike tone as if she was presenting a proposal at a board meeting. "Ryan calculated that we could split the mortgage payment 3 ways instead of 2, which would save Derek and Tasha about $400 a month. And we'd help with all the utilities and groceries too, of course." The presumption in her words was staggering. She was talking about our mortgage payment, our utilities, our home as if she already had equal rights to make decisions about them. She was treating our house like it was communal family property rather than something Derek and I had worked for years to afford and had only owned for 3 months. Derek's grip on my hand had become almost painful, and I could feel him struggling to maintain his composure. He'd always been the calm one in our relationship, the person who could defuse tense situations with humor or diplomacy, but this was so far outside the bounds of normal social interaction that even his considerable people skills were useless. I looked out at all the faces staring at us and felt this wave of humiliation wash over me. These were our friends, our family members, our coworkers, people we'd carefully chosen to share this special day with us. They'd taken time off work, traveled from out of town, bought gifts, and dressed up to celebrate our marriage. And now they were all witnesses to this bizarre family drama that should have been handled privately, if it should have been happening at all. The cake in front of us, which had been the centerpiece of this moment we'd been looking forward to all evening, now seemed like a prop in some surreal performance. The beautiful 3 tiers decorated with sugar flowers, the elegant silver cake server we'd borrowed from Derek's grandmother, the carefully arranged candles and flowers surrounding the table, all of it felt tainted by this confrontation. I could feel tears starting to burn behind my eyes, not just from anger but from a deep sense of grief for the moment that had been stolen from us. We would never get to redo our cake cutting. This memory, whatever happened next, would forever be associated with our wedding day. Every time we looked at our wedding photos, every time we told the story of our reception, this would be part of it. And then I felt Derek's body shift beside me, and I knew that something was about to change. Derek released my hand and took a step forward, and I felt the entire energy in the room shift as everyone sensed that something significant was about to happen. He moved with this quiet confidence that I'd seen before during difficult situations, but there was something different about his demeanor now, a protective intensity that I'd never witnessed directed at anyone in my family before. He looked directly at Cassandra, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the silent room with perfect clarity. There was no anger in his tone, no shouting or dramatics, just this calm, measured authority that somehow made his words even more powerful than if he'd been yelling. "Cassandra, I need you to listen to me very carefully," he began, and something in his voice made everyone in the room lean in slightly. "What you've just done is completely unacceptable, and I want you to understand exactly why before we go any further." Cassandra's confident smile faltered for the first time since she'd started this whole spectacle. She'd clearly expected either immediate agreement to her plan or at most some mild negotiation about the details. The firm, serious way Derek was addressing her had caught her completely off guard, and I could see uncertainty creeping into her expression. "First," Derek continued, his voice never wavering, "this is our wedding day. Not a family meeting, not a casual dinner where you can make announcements about major life decisions that affect other people. This day is about Natasha and me celebrating our marriage with the people we love most. That you would choose to hijack this moment shows a level of selfishness that honestly shocks me. I could see people in the crowd nodding slightly in agreement, and I felt this rush of gratitude that someone was finally articulating what I'd been feeling but couldn't find words for. Derek wasn't attacking Cassandra personally, but he was clearly and calmly explaining why her behavior was wrong, and the reasonableness of his approach made his words even more devastating. Second, he went on, you've just announced that you're moving into our home without ever asking us. Not suggesting it, not requesting it, not even bringing it up as a possibility for discussion. You've presented it as a done deal and tried to use the public setting of our wedding to pressure us into going along with it. That's not how respectful adults handle living arrangements, Cassandra. That's manipulation. Ryan had moved closer to Cassandra and was tugging gently on her arm, clearly wanting her to stop this before it went any further. But she seemed frozen in place, her wine glass still in her hand, staring at Derek with this expression of growing realization that this wasn't going according to her plan at all. Third, Derek continued, and I could hear his voice getting slightly more intense while still maintaining that calm control, you've done this in front of our entire wedding party, our families, our friends, and our co-workers. You've put Natasha in a position where she has to either publicly agree to something she never consented to or look like the bad guy for refusing to help family. That's not just selfish, Cassandra, it's cruel. The word cruel hung in the air like a physical presence. I'd never heard Derek describe anyone that way before, and I could see from the shocked expressions around us that other people were equally surprised by the strength of his language. But as I thought about it, I realized he was absolutely right. What Cassandra had done was cruel, even if she hadn't consciously intended it that way. And finally, Derek said, his voice now carrying a note of finality that made it clear he was building toward his main point, I've watched for years as you found ways to overshadow or complicate every important moment in Natasha's life. Her graduation, her promotions, her achievements, somehow there's always some crisis or announcement or drama that pulls attention away from her successes and makes everything about you instead. I felt my breath catch as Derek articulated something I'd never been able to put into words myself. The pattern he was describing had been so consistent throughout my life that I'd stopped noticing it, but hearing it laid out so clearly made me realize how much damage it had done to my ability to celebrate my own accomplishments. But this time is different, Derek continued, and there was steel in his voice now. Natasha is my wife now, and I will not stand by and watch you take this day away from her the way you've taken so many others. This ends here, tonight, right now. The silence in the room was so complete that I could hear the faint sounds of traffic from the street outside Rosewood Manor. Every single person in that reception hall was hanging on Derek's every word, and I could see that even the catering staff had stopped what they were doing to listen. Cassandra's face had gone through several color changes during Derek's speech, cycling from confusion to embarrassment to what looked like dawning anger. She glanced around the room as if looking for someone to come to her defense, but everyone was either staring at Derek with admiration or looking at her with varying degrees of disapproval. I don't know what you thought was going to happen here tonight, Derek said, his voice softening slightly but losing none of its firmness. Maybe you thought we'd be so caught up in wedding happiness that we'd just go along with whatever you suggested. Maybe you thought the public setting would pressure us into agreeing. But what's actually going to happen is this: you're going to apologize to Natasha for ruining this moment, and then you're going to figure out your own housing situation like the adults you're supposed to be. I felt this overwhelming surge of love and gratitude toward my new husband that was so intense it almost knocked me over. For years, I'd been handling Cassandra's behavior by myself, always trying to be the understanding sister, the peacekeeper, the one who accommodated everyone else's needs. But Derek had just done something that no one in my family had ever done. He'd called out the pattern clearly and directly, without apologizing for it or trying to soften the truth. Ryan had gone completely pale and was now actively trying to pull Cassandra away from the cake table, whispering urgently in her ear. I could see him saying, "We need to leave," and "I'm so sorry," repeatedly, but Cassandra seemed rooted in place, staring at Derek with this mixture of shock and growing indignation. "You can't talk to me like that," she said finally, her voice shaking slightly. "You don't even really know me. You've only been part of this family for a few hours." Derek's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes that made it clear he wasn't going to back down. "You're right," I haven't known you very long. But I've known Natasha for 6 years, and I've seen how these interactions affect her. And now that she's my wife, protecting her happiness is my responsibility. So yes, I absolutely can talk to you like this when you're treating her this way." The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how Cassandra would respond to this direct challenge to her behavior. And that's when I realized that for the first time in my life, someone was fighting for me instead of asking me to fight for myself. Cassandra's face went through a series of rapid transformations: shock, indignation, embarrassment, and finally a kind of desperate defiance that I recognized from our childhood. It was the same expression she'd worn when she'd been caught red-handed doing something wrong but still refused to admit fault, doubling down instead of backing down even when everyone could see she was in the wrong. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice getting louder and taking on that shrill quality that always emerged when she felt cornered. "I was trying to help. I thought you'd be happy to have family close by, to share expenses and create a real home together. But apparently you're too selfish to see what a good opportunity this is for everyone." The audacity of her words, calling us selfish after what she'd just done, sent a ripple of shocked murmurs through the crowd. I could see people shaking their heads in disbelief, and several of our guests exchanged meaningful glances that clearly communicated their thoughts about who was being selfish in this situation. Derek remained perfectly calm, but I could see a muscle in his jaw tightening as he processed Cassandra's response. "The opportunity to help family," he said slowly, "comes through conversation, through asking, through respecting other people's boundaries and decisions. It doesn't come through public manipulation and assumptions about other people's property and finances." Ryan had finally managed to get Cassandra's attention and was speaking urgently in her ear, his face flushed with embarrassment. I could see him gesturing toward the crowd of watching guests and shaking his head repeatedly, clearly trying to make her understand how inappropriate this entire situation had become. But Cassandra brushed him off with increasing agitation, her focus entirely on Derek and what she obviously saw as his unreasonable resistance to her generous offer. "You know what?" Cassandra said, her voice now carrying that familiar edge of martyrdom that I'd heard countless times throughout our lives. "Fine. I can see that you've already turned my sister against her own family. I should have expected this from someone who barely knows us, who has no idea how close Tasha and I have always been." The revisionist history in that statement was so blatant that I felt something snap inside me. All those years of accommodating her behavior, all those times I'd swallowed my hurt feelings and tried to be the understanding sister, all those moments when I'd let her reframe situations to make herself look like the victim, suddenly I couldn't tolerate it for one more second. "Stop," I said, my voice cutting through her words with a sharpness that surprised even me. "Just stop, Cassandra. Derek hasn't turned me against anyone. He's the first person who's ever stood up for me when you do things like this, and that doesn't make him the problem, it makes him exactly the kind of partner I need." Cassandra turned to look at me with genuine shock, as if she couldn't believe I was speaking to her this way. Throughout our entire relationship, I'd been the accommodating one, the one who smoothed over conflicts and tried to see everyone's perspective. But standing there in my wedding dress, holding my husband's hand, I felt a strength and clarity that I'd never experienced before. "This isn't about being close," I continued, my voice getting stronger with each word. "Close families don't ambush each other with major life decisions at weddings. Close families don't use public pressure to manipulate each other into agreements. Close families don't make someone else's special day about themselves." I could see my mother moving closer to the front of the crowd, her face a mixture of pride and concern as she watched me finally speak up for myself in a way I'd never done before. My father was right behind her, and for the first time in years, I could see approval in his expression as he watched me set boundaries with Cassandra instead of just accepting whatever she decided to do. But it was the expression on Derek's face that meant the most to me. He was looking at me with such love and admiration, such clear pride in watching me find my voice and use it to protect our marriage and our boundaries. I realized that this moment, as painful and chaotic as it was actually showing me exactly why I'd married this man and exactly what kind of partnership we were going to have. "And you know what else?" I said, feeling momentum building as 28 years of suppressed frustration finally found an outlet. "I'm tired of pretending that this is normal sibling behavior. I'm tired of making excuses for it and adapting my life around it. Derek and I worked for years to buy our house. We saved money, we made sacrifices, we earned every square foot of that space. It belongs to us, and we get to decide who lives there and under what circumstances. Cassandra's wine glass was shaking in her hand now, and I could see tears starting to form in her eyes, but they seemed more like tears of anger and frustration than genuine sadness or remorse. "I can't believe you're doing this to me," she said, her voice taking on that wounded quality that had always made me feel guilty for standing up to her in the past. "At your own wedding, in front of everyone we know. I was just trying to help, and you're humiliating me." The attempted guilt trip that would have worked on me just hours earlier now seemed transparent and manipulative. "You're humiliating yourself," I said firmly. "I didn't make you announce a living arrangement that we never agreed to. I didn't make you choose our cake-cutting moment to drop this bomb. Those were your choices, and the consequences are your responsibility." Ryan had finally had enough and stepped forward, gently but firmly taking Cassandra's wine glass from her hand and putting his arm around her shoulders. "Come on, Cassie," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the tense silence in the room. "Let's go home and talk about this privately. This isn't the time or place." But Cassandra wasn't ready to give up yet. She looked around the room at all the faces staring at her, clearly searching for someone who would validate her perspective or come to her defense. When she found only expressions of disapproval and discomfort, her desperation became even more apparent. "Mom," she said, turning toward our mother with pleading eyes. "You understand, right? You know I was just trying to help. Tell them that families are supposed to support each other." I held my breath as I watched my mother struggle with the decision. Throughout our entire childhood, she'd been the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over conflicts and found ways for everyone to get along. Cassandra was clearly expecting her to step in and defuse this situation by asking me to be more understanding, to find some middle ground that would allow everyone to save face. But something had changed in my mother's expression during this confrontation. Maybe it was seeing the pattern laid out so clearly by Derek, maybe it was watching me finally stand up for myself, or maybe it was simply recognizing how inappropriate this entire situation had become. Whatever it was, when she spoke, her words surprised everyone in the room, including me. "Cassandra," my mother said quietly but firmly, "Ryan is right. This needs to end now." The shock on Cassandra's face was complete and devastating, and that's when everything finally fell apart. The moment my mother spoke those words, something fundamental shifted in Cassandra's entire demeanor. The defiance that had been sustaining her throughout this confrontation crumbled completely, replaced by a look of betrayal and disbelief that was almost painful to witness. She stared at our mother as if she'd been physically slapped, her mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. "Mom," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're taking their side? Against your own daughter?" The pain in her voice was genuine, but there was also this underlying manipulation that I'd become so familiar with over the years, the way she could make anyone who disagreed with her feel like they were being cruel and unreasonable. But this time, instead of the usual family dynamic where everyone would rush to reassure her and find ways to accommodate her feelings, there was just uncomfortable silence. My mother took a deep breath, and I could see her gathering her courage to say something that went against every instinct she'd developed over decades of managing family harmony. "Cassandra, this isn't about taking sides. This is about recognizing that what you've done tonight is wrong, and someone needs to tell you that before it gets any worse." The simplicity and directness of my mother's words seemed to hit Cassandra harder than all of Derek's careful explanations combined. This was the woman who had spent 28 years making excuses for Cassandra's behavior, finding ways to reframe situations so that everyone could feel good about themselves. To hear her mother directly state that she was wrong, without qualifiers or suggestions for how everyone could compromise, was clearly devastating. Ryan tightened his grip on Cassandra's shoulders and leaned down to speak quietly in her ear again. I couldn't hear exactly what he was saying, but his body language made it clear that he was desperately trying to get her to leave before she made the situation any worse for herself. He kept glancing around at all the watching faces with obvious embarrassment, probably thinking about how he'd have to face these people at future family gatherings. But Cassandra wasn't ready to give up yet. She pulled away from Ryan and turned back to face me and Derek, her eyes now bright with unshed tears and her face flushed with a combination of alcohol, embarrassment, and anger. "Fine," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I can see exactly how this family is going to work now. I try to bring us closer together, and everyone turns on me. I offer to help with expenses and share a home, and I get treated like I'm some kind of criminal." The way she was reframing the situation, even in the face of overwhelming evidence that she was in the wrong, was almost impressive in its persistence. She was still trying to position herself as the victim, as the misunderstood sister who had been trying to help but was being punished for her generosity. It was a narrative that might have worked in the past, but standing there surrounded by 150 witnesses to what had actually happened, it fell completely flat. Derek stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between me and Cassandra in a subtle but protective gesture that didn't go unnoticed by anyone in the room. "Cassandra," he said, his voice still calm but with an edge of finality that hadn't been there before, "you didn't offer anything. You announced that you were moving into our house without asking us first. There's a significant difference between those two things, and I need you to understand that." "Whatever," Cassandra snapped, her composure finally cracking completely. "I can see that you've already decided I'm the villain here, so there's no point in trying to explain anything to people who don't want to understand." She looked around the room one more time, and I could see her taking in all the faces staring back at her with expressions ranging from disapproval to outright disgust. Our guests had come here expecting a joyful celebration, and instead they'd witnessed this painful family drama that had revealed uncomfortable truths about relationships and boundaries. "You know what?" Cassandra continued, her voice getting louder again as she seemed to find a second wind of indignation. "Maybe this is for the best. Maybe now I can see what kind of people you really are. I offer to be part of your lives, to share in your success, and this is how I get treated." The irony of her words was staggering. She was talking about sharing in our success while having just tried to claim partial ownership of the house that Derek and I had worked years to afford. She was talking about being treated badly while having just hijacked our wedding reception to announce major life decisions that would affect us without our consent. Ryan had apparently reached the end of his patience with trying to handle this diplomatically. He stepped forward and took Cassandra's arm more firmly this time, his embarrassment and frustration finally overriding his usual gentle approach with her. "Cassie, we're leaving. Now. This has gone far enough. Don't tell me what to do," Cassandra said, pulling away from him again, but there was less strength in her resistance now. The combination of alcohol, emotional exhaustion, and the slowly dawning realization that absolutely no one was going to support her position was beginning to take its toll. That's when Jake, Derek's brother, did something unexpected. He stepped forward from where he'd been standing with the other groomsmen and addressed Cassandra directly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd had enough of watching his brother's wedding be destroyed. "Ma'am," he said, his tone respectful but firm, "I think it's time for you to go home and sleep this off. Tomorrow, when you're sober, maybe you'll be able to see why what you've done here tonight was so wrong. But right now, you're just making it worse for everyone, including yourself." The fact that Jake had felt compelled to step in, Derek's younger brother, who barely knew my family and would normally never insert himself into someone else's family drama, seemed to finally penetrate Cassandra's awareness of how bad this situation had become. She looked at him with surprise, then looked around the room again, and for the first time, I could see recognition in her eyes of how isolated she'd become. "Fine," she said finally, her voice now small and defeated. "If that's how everyone feels, then I guess there's nothing left to say." She turned toward the exit, and Ryan immediately moved to accompany her, shooting apologetic looks back at Derek and me over his shoulder. But just as they reached the edge of the crowd, Cassandra stopped and turned back one more time, and I could see that she wasn't quite ready to accept defeat yet. "Just remember," she called out, her voice carrying across the silent room, "when you're sitting in that big empty house all by yourselves, that you had family who wanted to be part of your lives, and you chose to push us away." And with that final attempt to rewrite the narrative and make us feel guilty for her behavior, she stormed toward the exit with Ryan trailing behind her, leaving behind a room full of shocked guests and a wedding reception that would never recover its original joy. But as I watched her leave, I realized something important. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty about her dramatic exit. Instead, I felt free. The silence that followed Cassandra's dramatic exit lasted for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. 150 people stood frozen in place, as if no one was quite sure whether the show was over or if there might be another act coming. The beautiful reception hall, which had been filled with celebration and joy just minutes before, now felt heavy with the weight of what everyone had witnessed. Derek and I were still standing behind the cake table, the ornate silver knife still in my hands, both of us trying to process what had just happened. The three-tier wedding cake in front of us, which should have been the centerpiece of a sweet, traditional moment, now seemed like a prop in some surreal drama that we'd never wanted to be part of. It was my father who finally broke the silence. He stepped forward from the crowd, his face showing a mixture of embarrassment, anger, and what looked like protective love for both Derek and me. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "I'm sorry that happened on your wedding day. Natasha, Derek, you handled that with more grace than it deserved." His words seemed to give permission for everyone else to react, and suddenly the room came alive again with quiet conversations, people moving closer to us to offer support, and the gradual resumption of normal reception activities. But there was an undercurrent of tension and awkwardness that couldn't be completely erased by good intentions and polite recovery efforts. Derek's parents appeared at our side almost immediately, his mother reaching out to squeeze my arm with genuine warmth and concern. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" she asked, and the kindness in her voice nearly brought me to tears. These people had welcomed me into their family with such open hearts, and now they'd witnessed this painful glimpse into the dysfunction I'd grown up with. "We're fine," Derek said, putting his arm around my waist and pulling me closer to him. "Actually, we're better than fine. We're exactly where we need to be." His words were clearly intended for everyone in the room to hear, and I could see guests nodding and smiling with approval at his response. But they were also meant for me specifically, a reminder that despite the chaos Cassandra had created, nothing had changed about our love for each other or our commitment to building a life together. Jake clapped Derek on the shoulder with obvious admiration. "I'm proud of you, brother," he said quietly. "That took guts, and it was the right thing to do." My mother approached us next, and I could see that she was struggling with her own emotions about what had transpired. For decades, she'd been the family peacekeeper, the one who found ways to smooth over conflicts and help everyone get along. Tonight had forced her to choose between enabling Cassandra's behavior and supporting my boundaries, and I could tell that making that choice publicly had been difficult for her. "Natasha," she said, taking both my hands in hers, "I should have said something years ago. I should have helped you learn to stand up for yourself instead of always asking you to be the one who gave in. I'm proud of you for finding your voice, and I'm grateful that Derek was there to support you." Her admission hit me harder than I'd expected. Throughout my childhood and young adulthood, I'd internalized the message that being the easy child meant always accommodating others, always being understanding, always putting family harmony above my own needs. To hear my mother acknowledge that this dynamic had been unfair to me felt like a validation I'd been waiting for my entire life. But it was the reaction of our friends that really helped me understand how abnormal Cassandra's behavior had been. Amber, my maid of honor, was openly crying as she hugged me tightly. "Tasha, I've watched her do this to you for years, but I never knew how to help. I'm so glad Derek was able to call it out the way he did." Rachel, my sorority sister who'd flown in from Seattle, was more direct in her response. "Honestly, I've been waiting for someone to put her in her place for years. What she did tonight was absolutely unacceptable, and you have nothing to feel guilty about." Derek's construction crew buddies were perhaps the most straightforward in their reactions. These were men who valued honesty and directness, and they weren't shy about expressing their opinions about what they'd witnessed. "That was some manipulation bullshit," one of them said bluntly to Derek. "Good for you for not letting her get away with it." Another added, "Your wife's lucky to have someone who'll stand up for her like that." Not every guy would have had the backbone to call out family drama at his own wedding. Their approval meant more to Derek than he probably let on, and I could see him standing a little straighter as he accepted their congratulations and support. The elderly relatives were having their own conversations about what had transpired, and I caught fragments of their discussions as they moved around the room. Derek's grandmother was telling anyone who would listen that in her day, announcing major life decisions at someone else's wedding would have been absolutely scandalous, and that Cassandra had shown a shocking lack of breeding and consideration. My own grandmother was nodding along with these sentiments, adding that she'd never seen such disrespectful behavior at a family celebration, and that Derek had shown real character in how he'd handled the situation. But it wasn't just the immediate family and close friends who were processing what had happened. Our co-workers, college friends, and more distant relatives were all having their own reactions to this unprecedented breach of wedding etiquette. I could see small groups throughout the room discussing the incident, and while I couldn't hear all their conversations, their body language made it clear that the consensus was overwhelmingly supportive of Derek and me. The vendors were trying their best to keep the reception moving forward smoothly despite the drama. Our DJ approached Derek and asked quietly whether we still wanted to proceed with the cake cutting or if we'd prefer to move on to other activities. The photographer was hovering nearby, clearly uncertain about whether this was a moment she should document or pretend hadn't happened. Derek looked at me with a question in his eyes, and I realized that this was the moment where we got to decide how the rest of our wedding reception would unfold. We could let Cassandra's behavior define the evening, allowing her dramatic exit to cast a shadow over everything that followed. Or we could reclaim our celebration and show everyone present that our marriage was strong enough to weather whatever challenges came our way. I picked up the cake knife with renewed determination, looked around at all the faces watching us with love and support, and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I think it's time to cut this cake and get back to celebrating our marriage." The cheer that went up from our guests was genuine and enthusiastic, and as Derek placed his hand over mine on the cake server, I knew that we'd passed our first test as a married couple with flying colors. The cake cutting itself turned into something beautiful and redemptive that I'll remember for the rest of my life. As Derek and I sliced through the bottom tier together, our guests cheered with genuine enthusiasm that felt even more meaningful after what we'd all been through together. When Derek fed me that first bite of vanilla cake with raspberry filling, he whispered, "Here's to standing up for ourselves," and I knew that this moment, despite everything that had preceded it, was exactly what our marriage was going to be about, supporting each other through whatever challenges came our way. The rest of the reception took on this incredible energy that I hadn't expected. Instead of the drama dampening everyone's spirits, it seemed like witnessing Derek and me handle conflict together had actually strengthened the celebration. People danced with more enthusiasm, the conversations became deeper and more meaningful, and there was this sense of genuine community that emerged from everyone having shared this intense experience together. Our photographer, Rebecca, pulled me aside later in the evening and told me that some of the most beautiful photos she'd captured were from right after the cake cutting, images of Derek and me looking at each other with such love and pride, surrounded by friends and family who were clearly celebrating not just our marriage, but our strength as a partnership. "These are the photos you'll treasure," she said, "because they show what your marriage can handle together." Derek and I stayed at the reception until the very last song, dancing and celebrating with our loved ones until nearly midnight. When we finally made it back to the bridal suite at Rosewood Manor, I collapsed onto the bed in my wedding dress, emotionally exhausted but somehow more confident in our relationship than I'd ever been before. "Do you think I was too harsh with her?" I asked Derek as he helped me out of my dress, a question that would have been automatic for me just hours earlier but now felt like something I needed to examine rather than automatically assume. Derek sat down beside me and took my hands, looking directly into my eyes. "Natasha, you set a boundary that should have been set years ago. You protected our marriage and our home from someone who was trying to manipulate us into decisions we never agreed to make. There was nothing harsh about that, it was exactly what the situation required." Over the next few days, as we settled into married life and processed what had happened at our reception, the responses from family and friends continued to reinforce that we'd handled the situation appropriately. Derek's parents called to check on us and express their continued support, with his father saying that he'd gained even more respect for both of us after watching how we'd navigated such a difficult situation together. My mother visited us at our house 3 days after the wedding and sat in our kitchen for hours, talking through the family dynamics that had led to this moment. She admitted that she and my father had enabled Cassandra's behavior for years by always asking me to be the one who compromised, and she committed to changing that pattern going forward. "You're married now," she said, "and your first loyalty has to be to Derek and the family you're building together. I should have helped you understand that years ago." The most surprising response came from some of Cassandra's friends who had been at the wedding. Two of them reached out to me within the first week to apologize for her behavior and to tell me that they'd been uncomfortable with what she'd done but hadn't known how to intervene. One of them admitted that Cassandra had mentioned her housing plan weeks earlier, but they'd assumed she was just thinking out loud, not actually planning to announce it at my wedding without discussing it with us first. Ryan called Derek about 10 days after the wedding to apologize more formally and to clarify that he'd had absolutely no knowledge of Cassandra's intention to make that announcement. He explained that he'd been just as shocked as everyone else, and that he'd been trying to convince her to leave from the moment she started talking about moving into our house. He also shared that their relationship had been strained since the wedding, as he'd finally begun to see patterns in her behavior that he'd previously overlooked or made excuses for. 3 weeks after our wedding, Cassandra sent me a text message that simply said, "I hope you're happy." There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what she'd done wrong, no attempt to repair our relationship. Just that one bitter sentence that somehow perfectly encapsulated her complete inability to take responsibility for her actions or understand why her behavior had been inappropriate. I showed the text to Derek, and instead of feeling guilty or sad like I would have in the past, I felt this surprising sense of relief. Her message confirmed that she still didn't understand what she'd done wrong, which meant that any attempt to rebuild our relationship would require me to go back to the old dynamic of accommodating her behavior and making excuses for her choices. "I'm not going to respond," I told Derek, and he nodded with approval. "You don't owe her a response," he agreed. "She had the opportunity to apologize and chose not to take it. That tells you everything you need to know about whether she's capable of the kind of relationship you deserve." 6 months later, as I'm writing this and reflecting on everything that happened, I can honestly say that our wedding day, despite or maybe because of the chaos Cassandra created, marked the beginning of the strongest, most authentic relationship I've ever had, not just with Derek but with myself. Learning to set boundaries, to prioritize my own needs and my marriage, to stop automatically accommodating other people's poor behavior, these were skills that the confrontation at our reception forced me to develop much faster than I might have otherwise. Derek and I have built a beautiful life together in our home, the same home that Cassandra tried to claim partial ownership of without our consent. We've hosted Thanksgiving dinner for both our families, we've had friends over for game nights in our finished basement, and we've turned the guest room into the home office we'd always planned. Every room represents our choices, our hard work, our shared vision for our future together. Cassandra and Ryan did eventually find their own apartment, and from what I've heard through family updates, they're doing fine financially. Her housing crisis resolved itself without requiring any family assistance, which confirmed what Derek and I had suspected, that her dramatic announcement at our wedding had more to do with wanting attention and control than with any genuine need for help. Our marriage has grown stronger through learning to navigate challenges together, to support each other's growth, and to protect the boundaries that keep our relationship healthy. The wedding reception confrontation that could have destroyed our special day instead became the foundation for a partnership built on mutual respect, honest communication, and unwavering support for each other. And whenever I look at our wedding photos, especially the ones taken right after we cut the cake, showing us surrounded by people who love and support us, I'm reminded that the best thing about that night wasn't the perfect venue or the delicious food or the beautiful decorations. It was discovering that Derek and I were exactly the kind of team I'd always hoped we'd be, capable of handling whatever challenges life might throw at us, together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.